All right, everybody. Welcome back to another episode of Phenomenal Conversation with Mr. Short. Today, I'm blessed to be joined by Dr. Gholdy Muhammad. How are you doing, Dr. Muhammad?
I'm doing well, thank you. How are you?
I am doing very well after a very, very long day. All right, so
Yeah.
so so we'll jump into it, guys. Dr. Muhammad has had a very storied career, but I always like to start at the beginning. So, Dr. Muhammad, just talk about like how your career began in education.
Well, I mean, since I was little and since I can remember, I knew I felt like I wanted to be a teacher. I love what teaching would do to me and how it made me feel. As a child, I would play school and play being a teacher, emulate a teacher coming home from school. I would watch teachers' moves in elementary school. So I always like felt drawn to education and the power in the positivity and all the possibilities it offers. And, I studied education in undergraduate and loved my courses. I
Mhm.
even had the opportunity to be a part of a program called Golden Apple Scholars of Illinois, where they
Mhm.
take early college and also high school students, and they give them extra training in preparation to be a teacher in Chicago
Ah,
public schools. So I was a part of that program, and it was very helpful and very energizing to also confirm that this is my career path.
mhm.
And I taught and I loved it. And I love my students. I love the energy. I love learning with
Mhm.
them. And so it was always just a very understood pathway because sometimes it's not always like that in life. And so it's nice that I
Oh,
have
trust me, I
that.
know.
Yeah. So that's how I came into teaching. It's just really from a passion, and I ended up later like wanting to study literacy, that from not just loving to read and write and loving what literacy brings. And I taught literacy as well, but I also felt drawn to the discipline of like English language arts and literature and reading
Mhm.
because of my faith. My faith has a lot to do with literacy, and literacy
Mhm.
sort of grounds Islam in many ways. And so I felt very connected, like culturally,
Mhm.
to literacy in that way. And it all just kind of made sense.
What is something like you kind of noticed? Did you know from, and we're kind of get into you, I guess you get into academia and your work, but did you kind of know from the start, even though I guess you got specialized training from the beginning, that you kind of were going to move past a traditional classroom role? And I know you looking through your
I
bio that,
didn't, at first, I didn't have plans to. I just thought I would teach until it was time to stop working. um, but early on, I had like this knack and love for administration and leadership. I don't know if I have like a joy for administration today, but back then I did. And everyone was sort of getting their master's degree. And I said, okay, well, maybe I'll try, educational administration. And I thought I wanted to be a principal. And I had served previously now already as like a literacy coach, as a classroom teacher. And I think I was like interim principal for 3 weeks. And I said, oh, I don't want to do this ever again. But I noticed something like about me and what other people were saying about me. Like I had a gift of lesson plans and curriculum, and like that's what I wanted to do. And I said, okay, well, maybe if something comes up with leadership in curriculum, like I'll do that. And that's what I did. I went for like a leadership position in curriculum and instruction.
Mhm.
And I got to work like in that way of like working with interventions at the time and core curriculum, and
Mhm.
for English language arts and literacy, and other content areas too. And I just loved it. I love training teachers. That's when I really started training teachers and working with them and coaching them and leading them. And I just loved it. And that's like, okay, this is what I was meant to do. And I got a little frustrated. I was a very young administrator too, and maybe I didn't have as much patience then, but I got frustrated because I didn't see the right kind of practices for the majority of Black students who we were teaching, but for all students, but we mostly taught Black children. I just didn't like what was happening. And I didn't like some of the comments. I didn't like how the school board didn't reflect the population of children. And I thought to myself, and there were times where I just started to feel more and more intellectually confined and constrained in the
Mhm.
district office. And I said, well, should I go back to being a teacher? Should I stay and get into a position where I become like, I have to stay a long time to get in that power position to become like their supervisor, the people who I was against. I was against their teaching, their beliefs about children. And I said, or maybe I'll go for my PhD. I always wanted to get my PhD. And I started to explore like programs, and then I just said, I just went full time. I left my administration job, which is a great position, and I had a lot of intellectual freedom for that position, but I wanted more. I wanted different. I had like a different calling, or like something inside of me said, I think it's time to leave. And that's what I did. I left.
Mm. So I guess it kind of naturally segues into more your move into academia and your work. So talk about that move into more academia and getting more into your work. Talk about your beginnings with that.
Well, I was living near like St. Louis, Southern Illinois at that time. And even though I'm from the Chicago area, I decided I had some family here who I wanted to get to know for the first time. And
Hmm.
I said, okay, well, why don't I explore a school in Chicago? And I was exploring schools in St. Louis before. And I ended up applying to UIC, and they had a great literacy program. And ironically, it's the same university I'm now a professor years later, but they had a program of language literacy and culture where you can extend curriculum and instruction. It's a curriculum and instruction degree, but a focus on literacy. And that's when I really started to explore what I was interested in studying. It was a whole different world for me, because stepping into like teaching in schools to academia and research and scholarship, it's a different way of talking and being. And I struggled a lot. Like I struggled a lot. And when people see me now and they're like, "Oh, you're successful. You got it all together." And I'm like, "Okay, let me take you back."
Hmm.
Um, and it certainly didn't feel that way then. And I struggled through it, but I kept at it. Like, I would stay up rereading stuff and writing. I just put all of myself into it in ways that I had never done with anything else. I mean, besides teaching, but I put myself into my program. And I ended up really studying like history, Black educational history within literacy. I ended up studying Black girl literacies. And I just would write and create and try. And it ended up like beautiful things ended up emerging from it. And then I said, well, I don't want to be a teacher. I mean, I didn't really want to be a professor. I wanted to go back, try administration, but more at a federal level. And but I noticed something. I would be writing all the time. I actually had the life of a professor,
Hmm.
something I thought I didn't want to do. And I love to teach. So I really then explored like different pathways of being a professor and working in teacher education. And that's kind of how I ended up here.
All right, so you kind of touched on as far as Black literacy, and one of the things I thought was pretty cool reading your book, although I still have to finish the last part, but I got through kind of the meat of it, was Black literary society, because I learned something new. I didn't know as much about. I mean, of course, I knew there, I guess, Black scholars, whether it's Frederick Douglass or people of those times, but I didn't know about there were whole societies, especially during slave times. So, what got you into really studying that time period? It seems like that was the framework for your framework.
Well, I always loved history and looking at the past. And my research at the time looked at the history of Black women writers to understand if Black girls wrote about the same topics, about the same themes, similar to Black women in the past.
Mm,
And I took a course with my advisor, Alfred Tatum. And it was like the archaeological history of Black male literacy development. I don't know. It was a long title. And I'm probably jacked it up. And I did not want to take this class because I was at the end of my program and I was tired and exhausted. And I took the class, and we each had to historicize our interests. So I was interested in writing groups for Black women because I was looking at a writing group for Black girls for my dissertation. And, just being in that class, we were sort of forced to find historical significance of what we were interested in Black communities, particularly in Black male communities or with Black males. But I still kept a wide enough lens for Black people. And then that's when I came upon Black literary societies and the work of Elizabeth McHenry, who wrote the book Forgotten Readers. She gives like the history of African American literary societies in the United States. So came upon her work, and then after that, it was just like a treasure map of different artifacts from the ancestors. It was really beautiful.
So that kind of leads again, natural segue. I love those. Into your book, Cultivating Genius. And I don't want to butcher the four, I guess, tenets of it, but I think it was identity, skill, intellect, and criticality. I think is the word. I might have butchered that. So how did you come up with those?
Well, as I was reading the scholarship, the writings, the newspaper clippings, everything that like the members of Black literary societies left, I read their speeches, their public addresses, all of that. And I said, it feels like they would call their learning goals pursuits. And I would feel like, okay, well, they were in the pursuit of identity here. And then I would read more and find more artifacts around identity. And then I would read more and I would say, okay, they were in the pursuit of intellect and new knowledge. They were in the pursuit of skill development. They were in the pursuit of criticality. I didn't call it criticality. I called it many other things at first. But as I continued to research, that word became refined for me. Mm-hmm. So those were the actual goals. And then the last pursuit, which I add to my forthcoming book, Unearthing Joy, the last goal being joy. And so those were goals and practices in different areas that were developed and cultivated for the ancestors in these literary societies. So that's how I came to that. So it was a lot of reading and a coding and organization into different categories and what made sense. And then I said, well, let me try out these four ways, these four pursuits in my teaching with Black girls in my dissertation. And oh, it's like beautiful. It was like all of those pursuits just kind of came alive. And I wasn't really like, I didn't have joy as a fifth pursuit at first. I was doing joyful things in classroom teaching. But after the pandemic hit, a lot of educators really took to my work. Mm-hmm. And at this time, the world was in disarray a bit. We had a lot of loss and folks were sick and teachers were online and struggling to navigate a lot in the system and they needed joy more than ever. The students needed joy, and joy just kind of kept coming to me. So I went back to the research and I added that as a fifth pursuit with some supporting literature. And so that's how they all came together. It was a lot of process and work and reading and writing and analysis. And some of it, I have to say, like, it's always a very spiritual act for me. I cannot, my editor says, how do you write such beautiful language? She's talking about the new book. How did you do this? Like, how are you writing these lines like this? And I said, I don't know. It has to be something bigger than me, in many ways. And I feel like it just comes. And then once it's over, I'm like, how did I just get that?
Yeah.
So it's also that.
Yeah, I know, like a lot of times when I write things, I know I write reflections on Sundays and I love to write myself, and I was a writer before I became a teacher. But there's a lot of times you be writing and you'll tend to write something one way, because I always like to write everything down before I write. And then once you start writing, it just comes out a different way. I was like, wait, I wasn't even intending to write it that way, but it just flows that way. It's awesome how it works.
Yeah, that's beautiful.
So One thing I kind of was interested in. So, if someone was listening, what is the difference to you between intellect and criticality? Because obviously, identity and skill, they're pretty identifiable as what they are. But what's the difference between intellect and criticality?
Well, intellect is just new knowledge about people, places, things, the world. I
Mm-hmm.
learned about frogs, trees, grass, journalism, worms. I mean, anything that's noun based. Criticality is where we help children and students to name, understand, and disrupt oppression. So one has something to do with oppression, one necessarily does not.
Mm-hmm.
Intellect is just new knowledge.
Mm-hmm.
But criticality is when we take that knowledge and we look at, like if we take a topic of what is journalism for intellectualism, right? And we say, okay, for criticality, I'm looking at the power of journalists of telling the truth, the justice related to journalism. I'm looking at the representation, like who gets to tell the story, what platform do they have, who's marginalized, who do they tend to interview, who are they not interview, what kind of stories are they telling and not telling. Like I'm looking at the power structures and issues of equity with that, and that's the
Mm-hmm.
difference between the two.
All right, excellent. So I guess with that, you came up with a framework. Now, obviously, framework comes with your background with curriculum. I saw that you've been able to get your framework within many, I guess, school districts. So
Mm-hmm.
was there a challenge kind of, I mean, we know now with CRT and all those different things like that within, I guess, the American school system and even a pushback on that. Um, has there been any challenges trying to get your framework within like, I guess, traditional school districts curriculum?
Well, my framework is not a curriculum, it's a framework to teach the curriculum. I haven't written a
Mm-hmm.
curriculum yet, but it hasn't been a challenge, but I don't try to get it out. People come to me really and
Mm-hmm.
ask for support or something. Um, and I've had that. That's a beautiful something where you don't have to push it. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, I do remember pushing this model 13 years ago. And people didn't really understand it. I didn't have a book, but once they heard me talk about it and show curriculum that I created, they loved it. So I would say, I mean, certainly there's some people who do not want me to talk or probably do not want me to speak about it
Mm-hmm.
because, and I've seen people write like in articles, like newspaper articles, they'll try to, I don't know, it's weird. Like they don't know my model, they can't speak about it, and they can't really say much about it. But they'll say like Gholdy Muhammad's equity model, so-called equity. It's like they don't go real far. And, I just want to challenge them to like a lesson plan write-off or like a lesson planning contest
Mm.
because it's like you don't know curriculum more than me. You don't know lesson plans more than me. Like you ain't gonna debate me. You really don't. So they keep it
I would say
real,
talk your
whatever.
talk.
Yeah. And it's like, I'm pretty sure some teachers and administrators struggle, but I help them. I help them to build better curriculum. And then sometimes they'll see it because a lot of like people don't talk about practicality. They just talk about justice or theory. And then some people, they only talk about reading, how to teach a child how to read and strategies and skills. So I'm doing all of that. And so it's like you really can't not listen. You got to be a little intrigued, right? And you cannot disagree that a child doesn't need identity growth. A child doesn't need intellect. A child does not need to know how to make the world a better place through criticality. And you can't argue that a child doesn't need joy.
Mm,
So I've had a lot of ease, but like I said, I'm pretty sure there's some silent pushback for my
mhm,
work. There hasn't been a whole lot of public pushback to me,
mm.
like to my face.
Do you
They
think your
might be behind
credentials?
my back.
Do you think your credentials kind of help with? I guess, like you said, it's more silent. I guess pushback than more open. Because I mean, you are a doctor and you do know curriculum. Do you think your credentials kind of help with?
I sure. Yeah. I think, people like being affiliated with having my PhD, being affiliated with the university that certainly helps. We've seen people though not have that and have like a major impact in the field of education. But
Hmm.
I think it's helped me, and having a book has helped me sometimes, because people would tell me, well, you got to write a book about this model. And I'm like, do I? Who says I do? And they said, well, people will take you more serious with the book. And I said, oh, okay. I mean, I didn't write it for that reason. I wrote it for my own joy, and I waited years before I was ready to write it. But yeah, I think so. But I think the more important thing is that I'm a doer of my word. I'm not just talking about teaching, I'm teaching children, I'm in communities, I'm
Mm.
working on school boards. I'm doing the work. I'm listening to teachers. I'm writing curriculum with them. I think teachers see me more as a partner to them, and they trust me. And I have done my work and I listen to them. So I think it's more of like that respect and rapport building that I do with them, that they respect the most.
Okay, so I guess going with that, and I guess I'm at the elementary level, so I guess I'm seeing just how the landscape is shifting. I'm only in my 7th year, so I've literally experienced the shift of, at one point when I first came in, even though I didn't know much about it, that you had balanced literacy, and now you got the science of reading and all these different. I know you kind of mentioned about these different things
Mhm.
going on.
Yeah.
So how do you see your framework and what you're trying to do fitting in with that? Because right now that's almost like I guess they called it the reading wars back when I guess I would have been a student in school. How do you
Yeah,
see
that's
what
a
you're
great
doing fitting,
question.
fitting in
So
with
you
that?
have to think of my model as like overarching. My model crosses all content areas, all age levels, right?
Mm-hmm.
Skills is 1/5 of the pursuits. And skills can be math, reading, writing, ELA, PE, arts, all these things. So let's just take reading skills.
Mm.
So you would typically have a reading skill or reading standard, reading proficiency you want to name. Like you might say students will learn letter sound relationships, or students
Mm-hmm.
will learn how to decode unfamiliar words, right? You would set a goal. My model is really about setting better and stronger goals. But the next step, right, is the approach to teaching those skills. Like, how do I get to reading development? And that's where all these different like framings of literacy, like the science of reading, phonics versus all these whole language and all these things come in. Balanced literacy brings in a little bit of whole language phonics, like the wholeness, and it fits with those different frameworks depending on how you teach reading. But the problem I have with those approaches alone
Mm-hmm.
is that when programs and curriculum are created from them, it's like decontextualized to the students' lives in the world around them. It
Mm-hmm.
really only focuses on their reading identity. And some students are not responding to the science of reading or to these things. So there has to be something more we have to look at.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I mean, I think balance, to call something balanced literacy, I get what they were getting at, but how can it be more balanced to the children's whole life?
Mm-hmm.
So going through those different aspects of reading development and how children learn how to read best, that's what those things do. It's like the next step to my model, which is like, okay, how are you going to teach those skills?
Have any of those people from any of those communities sought you out? Because they are true communities. I guess I'm starting to learn. So any people from those communities reached out to you of maybe how they can, I guess the word is culture responsive
Uh,
or.
yeah, a little. Mm-hmm.
Mm.
And some people who come with different frameworks who've been having curriculum in schools for years, I have not agreed with,
Mm-hmm.
has sought me out or asked me for support or all this or training.
Mm.
And I think, one thing we're trying to think through now is how can these traditional reading approaches, reading development, be paired as a curriculum? Because that's the next thing that's needed. A lot of these folks have never created curriculum to be culturally responsive.
Mm-hmm.
They have just addressed academic skills. And so, because that's, reading, a lot of reading researchers traditionally, like back in the day, they would come from psychology
Mm-hmm.
backgrounds, not necessarily from like teaching diverse children. And so, there are some people that still to this day only want to focus on reading skills and call kids illiterate and says, well, we cannot get to all these other things, Gholdy, until we teach a child how to read. I said, well, we can't do both at the same time. What kind of
It's,
limit,
it's really
like,
not that hard.
yeah, you're like posing limitations to what we are capable of.
It's just interesting to me. Even sometimes I've taught stuff and probably didn't even realize. Like even today, I was working with some students and it was, I don't know, it was a passage or something, and it talked about an experience you had when you went walking or bicycling. And I was like, I hate to put it, like black kids don't really talk like that. They're not saying I'm going bicycling or walking. I was like, I can see where a kid might look at that and go like, what are you talking about? I might have said I went to ride a bike, but nobody said you had
Yeah.
any. So it's like little things like that. Even I catch.
Oh, yeah, I can see that. There's a lot of those small nuance kind of language uses in assessments and curriculum. There's a lot, and then there's some things like I remember a New York teacher told me it was a passage about a farm in a rural area, and like her kids were like in the Bronx, and she was like, I don't think they related to this. But
No,
you know who it related to? The people who are writing it. They don't write for our communities or Houston or the Bronx. They don't go and interview children and get to know the community. They write from their own lived experiences. And, then a child is reading that and saying, okay, well, this is not how we talk.
Oh, trust me, they really are off the chain in Texas. They think like on these tests, them being cultural responses is putting a character in a story that's named Keisha. That's that.
Yeah.
But that's
Yeah.
that's a whole.
Yeah, they think that, or even putting a story about, even if you put a story about a Black family, I don't think that's culturally responsive. That's just you just have greater representation of Black culture, even if the story is great. I don't think that's fully culturally responsive. That's just multicultural representation.
Well, it
We
was
can call it
interesting.
that.
What's interesting in teaching elementary, a lot of kids don't even look at that stuff that way. I mean, even a lot of, I think it's kind of unfair to black kids. I always got to read stories about, like someone else said, nobody wants to read stories about the stuff they're going through and the struggle. They want to read a fun story. I actually had let one of my students sit my library once, and she said it is serious and not so serious. That's how they look at them, how they
Yeah.
look at books. So I'm like, why black?
Well, we need more joyful. I mean, we do have more and more joyful picture books and YA books, but I've heard students say that too, because a lot of times they only read about the Black struggle, civil rights, Dr. King, Rosa Parks, enslavement. They don't just get to read. Like, that's why I like so many of these authors today, like Derek Barnes, who wrote a book about the fresh haircut, Crown. And, Black Girl Dreaming and like The Day You Begin. It's just like we have those examples, but sometimes schools don't support those authors or books. Like they got to order those books so they're there.
Awesome. So I guess just to close out, where do you kind of feel like education is going, and just kind of like to close out, what would be some advice you give to any teacher? And I guess I'll be specific of teachers of Black and brown children.
Where education is going. I don't know. I mean, I like to wake up and have hope, right? That we are going toward these 5 pursuits. We're going toward joy. We're going toward criticality. It's hard when, we've been doing this equity work for years, and then folks come up with these very hateful legislations and policies and being under fire for teaching about justice pertaining to Black lives and Black people, but I see so much hope for the future, because I see the teacher programs are bringing this work in. We are developing a different type of new teacher. I see hope in the teachers I get to work with. Like, they want something more. The administrators do. So I would hope that the future really starts to change, 5 areas, these state assessments, the curriculum, the state learning standards, the teacher evaluation, and teacher education programs. I don't know. I cannot say, because people want this work, but I don't know if they're ready to make it mandatory and mandated and make it expected. I think they want to push it and encourage it, but that's where I'm kind of sitting. Like, are y'all really serious about this? Because if you are serious, you'll write it in your teacher evaluation in your policy.
Oh yeah, changes
And I
then.
know it's not that easy, but it's also not that hard.
Mm-hmm. So
And in terms of like advice for new teachers, particularly like, Black and brown teachers, the best thing we can do is know who we are, know the genius and the joy of our own lives, and give children what they need. We don't want despite of children who achieve despite of a system, despite of curriculum, despite of this and that. We want joy. Like I would advise them to rest, seek your own joy, and give children what they need so that they don't have to overcome a classroom, a curriculum, or a school.
I think that's the perfect way to end. I'd like to thank Dr. Gholdy Muhammad for her time. This has been Mr. Short, another episode of Phenomenal Conversations with Mr. Short. Thank you for listening.